I think one of the hardest things at scale is finding the balance between Christianity and liberalism,
Mm-hmm.
right? So how much we've talked a little bit about how much influence there should be there, but how do you balance the principles and morality of Christianity with the look, we live ultimately in a classically liberal society. If you're in a Western country compared to the rest of the world, compared to history, you live in a liberal society. So how do you balance those things, right? So because you get a lot of obvious clashes. So let's say freedom of speech, right? I'm pretty much
Mm-hmm.
a freedom of speech absolutist. However, when you I spend a lot of time in the UAE. The countries I spend the most time in are the UK, the UAE, and USA, all the united ones. And obviously, each country has its own different approach to this. So if you're in an Islamic country, they generally they don't front about it. They're like, no, we don't have absolute freedom of speech, right? You can't you can't blaspheme, you can't talk bad about the prophet, maybe even the royal family, etc. Certain things are just like clearly off limits, and that's because they don't want to let's do you know what it really is they put the adherence to the religion above so-called liberalism and what we in the West would consider freedom. They're like,
Mm-hmm.
no, it's more important that our religious principles are not undermined by people just being able to say and do whatever the heck they want about our most revered things and most revered people and even God himself, right? That's their
Yeah.
attitude. From a Western perspective, whether people are conservative or liberal or progressive, most people would consider that authoritarian or dogmatic or no, like that's the wrong way, because in the West, whether or not we know it, people generally put liberalism above that, and people could argue that that's the way it should be, because if you have pure true freedom of religion and freedom of speech and so on. So I don't know what the answer is here. This is the thing that
Mm-hmm.
I think is complicated, is how do we as a society and as nations thread that needle between, okay, we support people's freedom of speech and freedom of expression and freedom of association and freedom of religion, but also um we but also we don't want this sort of complete undermining and desecration of the things that are most revered and sacred. You see what I mean? It's a complicated one, and I don't know socio-politically, culturally, I'm not quite sure what the correct approach is on some of these things. I think you can do it on an individual level, but I don't quite know how it scales.
Yeah, well, it's complex, and complex issues require complex solutions. There's not going to be a thing I can just give a 15-minute spiel to say that would fix everything. But I mean, you're right about, we don't want to go too far, like anti-free speech, but we'd also want to go too far to the left. I mean, Roland to Salem's paper, The Role of Protestantism in Democratic Consolidation Among Transitional States, looked at Protestant, Catholic, and Islamic states. And he found that the Christian states correlated with more political stability, voice and accountability in government, ability to create political transformation, and the Islamic states did not. So we don't want to go too far in that direction. The pendulum is really far to the left right now. We don't want to swing it too far to the right and destroy stuff. So where do we find this balance? I mean, the balance between liberalism and Christianity. I think the problem that liberalism has is it destroyed too many other societal institutions and assumed we didn't need them.
Yes.
The idea originally in Europe was that, the separation of church and state. We are going to have the state is going to focus on some things. The church will focus on other things. The family is going to focus on some things. The schools will focus on some things. And I think secular liberals went too far and say, well, we don't need the church anymore. We don't need the family anymore. We need the schools, but they need to be run by the state itself. And the original idea was that, that comes out of Christian Europe is this idea that there are different institutions for different purposes. And they sort of function together like holding up a table. And when you start throwing out one leg, the table's going to not work as well. So we do need Christianity, but we don't. But I do think there needs to be some sort of separation of church and state. The church works best when it's actually out doing work and it's not just being funded by the government. Because what happens is the clerics, the priests get lazy. They just get money coming in. They're not going to go out and do the work. When they actually need to go out and do charity, find people that help support them, to find donors actually help do their causes, they're more motivated to go out and do the work because it's more grassroots based. So I think we need to recognize in the West that we need to have different institutions. We don't have a very well-rounded view right now of how humans can function in societies. We just think we need government-run schools, government-run healthcare. If we have that, we'll be fine. But there needs to be these separate institutions that sometimes fight against each other in certain ways for different values, because sometimes out of struggle comes growth. So comes change sometimes we need. So I think we need to get back to the idea that we have the institution of the state, we have the institution of the church, the institution of the family, the institution of schools, and other various institutions as well. And we need to nurture them. We need to recognize that sometimes they'll be at odds, but that can be good because out of that chaos can come some growth. And there's going to be no perfect solution because humans are not perfect. As Immanuel Kant said, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. So we need to also recognize we're not going to get something perfect, and we need to be okay with that. We're not going to build a utopia until Christ returns, as I like to say. So I think if we can recognize that aspect of us and just be okay with not being perfect, I think we'll actually do much better because we won't be trying so hard to turn something into it's not, which is crooked humanity into something that it could never really be.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think where it gets really tricky is when it gets into really serious issues, right? When it comes to something like the value of a human life, right? This is a wall that I think probably maybe 30 years ago, people didn't think that we'd be facing, where you're having, conversation. Well, I guess abortion laws and stuff were really from like the 1960s. So I guess, people have been thinking about it for a while now. But I mean, look, I went back home. I went back to the UK for Christmas, and I saw a leaflet that had been dropped into my parents' letterbox about quote unquote assisted dying, which is something that obviously is already legal in places like Switzerland and the Netherlands, and they're liberalizing it further in Canada. In fact, in some parts of Canada, it's now one of the leading causes of death. They call it MAID over there. Tens of thousands of Canadians have been killed intentionally by doctors. And of course, slippery slope, right? Of course, it starts with terminal illnesses, and then it becomes mental illnesses, and then it becomes, oh, you don't have enough money to survive, or you've got some PTSD from the war, or eventually it just becomes, hey, your body, your choice. Like, regardless of who you are, if you're a consenting adult, you should be able to end your life at any time. Now, these are the type of things where, if everyone was operating from the same moral foundation, it wouldn't even be a conversation. It wouldn't be. And it didn't used to be. But things have veered off enough in a direction now where you can, people are pushing for abortion up until the point of birth for any reason, which I think is already the law in Canada. I mean, the law is pretty extreme in the UK. I mean, it's for any reason, taxpayer funded up to 24 weeks. And then if there's any minor, like any issue, like beyond that. And now now at the other end of life, you've got all these conversations about so-called assisted dying, where you can just go to a doctor and have your life ended. Now, as I don't even want to even have to say, like, as a Christian, that disgusts me. Like, I would think that even for non-religious people, this should be something that makes them all go like, oh my gosh, like, what are we moving towards as a society? But I'm seeing more and more people defending and promoting these kind of ideas and going, oh, actually, maybe you should have that, right? That's freedom. That's liberalism. And again, this is, and I'm sure you, of course, when it comes to these topics, you'll have people say, hey, don't bring your religion into this. Don't bring your, and I'm like, dude, I'm not quoting scripture here. I'm just saying, like, yo, do we not even have the same morality and viewpoint towards the value of a human life anymore? Because if we don't, then I see that getting very dystopian very quickly. I could see a potential future in 30, 40 years from now where, like, it's pretty gnarly, where people sort of approach to human life and its value and what people can and should do and what's an infringement on freedom and whatever has just become totally perverse, where it's become that consent is the only principle of morality. And as long as something is consensual, no matter what it is or no matter how heinous it is, it should be not just permissible, but perhaps even promoted and celebrated. This really seems to be the direction that we're going if we're not careful.
Yeah, it's very scary. And this is, again, as I said, it's Christian ethics gone mad. It's people, they're so focused on caring for others, they end up killing them because they don't want them to experience any sort of pain, whether physical or mental. And, it's unfortunate because, I think of Jonathan Haidt's different moral foundations. It's, people that tend to gravitate more towards secularism just care about harm, fairness. We got to reduce harm, increase fairness. But a Christian, someone who's more conservative, is going to say, well, what about the sanctity of life itself? What about the what they're going through? And we just can't take a life because we're not God. There's something sacred there that needs to continue on. And so, you can look at Haidt's different moral foundations. You can say that, people that are more conservative Christians have a more well-rounded view of different virtues that they have to think about when looking at these situations. If all we are thinking about is fairness and harm, the two that Haidt talks about, you're going to go off into these dystopian nightmares, because how far are we going to go? Well, we can't let this person suffer anymore because they're depressed, so we're just going to kill them. We have to have abortions up till the 2 minutes before the child is born, because the mother might change her mind at the last minute. We don't want to infringe on her
or even afterwards. I'm sure you've seen there's people advocate that.
Well, yeah, but if you go back to the ancient Roman Empire, that was the norm. They didn't think a kid up to the age of like 2 or so, roughly, was actually an individual. So we can identify brothels by the amount of infant graves around them, because they would have that's where they would bury the infant. They'd have infant, they'd bury them so they get back to work, kind of thing. And so maybe we'll move more to that direction. It's scary to think about, but we do need something to tether us to the ground to prevent us from going off into this direction. I remember my pastor said, the problem with our society now is it's like a plant that has been plucked up from the ground so it can get closer to the sun. It will look very pretty for some time being because it grew from a great foundation, but now that it's been pulled out from that foundation, it's going to wither and die. So, we got to be very careful about that, what we think we can pluck out from our Christian heritage, our Christian foundation, and think we're going to be okay. We can't. These are tied very much to the Christian religiosity aspects, and to think we can just get away from them. I think in 30 or 40 years, I know long term, I'm optimistic. I think we will revert back to a more of a Christian foundation. But 30 or 40 years, I think a lot of people are going to look back, go, oh God, what have we done? We were just trying to help people, and look at this dystopia we've created.